Well, there we are, the first car launch of 2021. McLaren have shown us the MCL35M, and it's a stunner. Will Buxton and Lawrence Barretto with you, as always, to take you through launch season. And Lawrence, great to see the first car for 2021.
Yeah, I think during the launch, Daniel Ricciardo was saying it's always quite exciting to see a new car. And for us, we get to see 10 new cars. And we've been waiting all winter to see what the teams are going to screw up this year. And finally, McLaren have kind of pulled off the cover of their first one.
And the headline with this, of course, is that with so much being carried over from 2020 to 21, the big changes which have actually occurred at McLaren mean that this will potentially and ostensibly be the most different car to its 2020 predecessor.
Yeah, I think it's quite fortuitous that we've had McLaren kind of kick off this launch season because, as you say, it's going to be so different. And that's because they've got a Mercedes engine plugged into the back of the car. In Formula One, it's not as easy as taking a Renault out and slotting the Mercedes in. You need to quite change a lot of the rear end architecture. So it's been a big job, a challenging one for McLaren because obviously, like you said, Will, you've got a lot of carryover from one year to the next. And because they've used their development tokens on trying to get this new engine in, it might mean that in other areas of the car where others have been able to take advantage, they haven't been able to move forward as much.
Well, we talk about the carryover from 2020 to 2021. So let's start by taking a look at how McLaren finished that 2020 season. Well, Lawrence, we all remember the final race in Abu Dhabi. Only seems like a couple of weeks ago. It was actually only a couple of weeks ago, really. But McLaren, of course, with that result, taking third in the Constructors' Championship. And the question I think I have to pose after 2020 is, was that the position they deserved, or was it a fortuitous position that they lucked into?
I think they deserved it based on the consistency that they showed through the season. They bookended their season quite well. Lando got that podium at the start, then they got that 4th, 5th at Abu Dhabi. And I think because they delivered results week in, week out in a way that Aston Martin and Renault, their main competitors, just couldn't do, I think they deserved it. I think it flatters them in some way in terms of the pure performance of the car. But I think in terms of what they did last year, the job that they did, they definitely deserved it.
It's been an amazing few years for McLaren. It was something which Daniel Ricciardo spoke about today, looking back on his 2 years with Renault and watching how McLaren actually developed over those 2 years. Because let's not forget, he had the option to join McLaren straight after he left Red Bull. That was one of his options, and he went to Renault, chose Renault instead. But it was McLaren that made the great strides, arguably team of the season in 2019. In 2020, again, doing such a phenomenal job. As you say, a podium at the start, all the way to the end of the season, that consistency that netted in that third place in the Constructors' Championship. But the team themselves said third, whether they finished there or fourth, it didn't really matter to them. What was important was how the team had come together, the processes, the practices, in terms of how they worked as one unit is what they would take from 2020 the most.
Yes, and I think that's probably what they're going to be looking for again, that continuation coming into this year. I think when Daniel signed for this team for McLaren, I think he was quite honest that the team weren't quite ready when he was going to sign for them initially. He's come here, and I think already he can see how different that team is, how settled that team is under Andreas Seidl. And I think they're looking in a very good shape. They're on that right trajectory, and that's kind of, at least he's lucked in this time by the looks of it, rather than going to Renault and it didn't quite work out.
Of course, they couldn't challenge the likes of Red Bull or Mercedes during the season. So I guess that does give us the question of what they have to improve from 2020 into 2021 in order to make this new season a success. So here we are, 2021, a new engine in the back of the car, a new driver in the team as well. It's a bit of a new look for McLaren.
Yeah, it's all changed really. And I think the engine is what we're all going to be talking about through pre-season testing in that early part of the season. It's the class leading engine. It's the one that really, if everyone's honest, they want in the back of their car. And for McLaren, if they're going to continue making these steps, bolting that in the back of the car and kind of rejuvenating that relationship that they had with Mercedes, obviously many years ago, is exactly the right thing. You talk about a new driver, Daniel Ricciardo. It's an amazing thing. He's 10 years older than Lando, and this is going to be his 11th season. Like, you could describe him as a veteran, not that he'd enjoy that term, I'm sure. Having him there, that fresh kind of injection of enthusiasm and experience, it could bode really well for these guys.
And what surprised me during the launch today was when Lando said, I'm coming into my third season in Formula One. And I had to sort of count back and think, is it really, was he not a rookie last year? And you know, that level of experience that Lando now has. He talked about wanting to be a team leader, about welcoming Daniel into the team. And there's that feeling when Daniel joined Renault and how quickly he wanted to get his legs under the table to make that team his own. And he was going up against Nico Hülkenberg, who of course had been a part of Renault for a while. Lando has been a part of that McLaren family, even if not in the Formula One team, for 5 years now. That is his place. How do we see that dynamic working between those two? Because as you say, Daniel is the more experienced driver, 10 years older than Lando, 11 years now in Formula One. And despite it being Lando's team, Daniel's going to want to, he's going to want to forge it in his own image, isn't he?
I think the initial signs are that they are getting on quite well. And I think that's quite important that you continue that kind of bromance feel, because I think that really strengthened McLaren last year with Carlos and Lando. Daniel is going to want to go in there and he's going to want to stamp his authority, whether he says that publicly or not. So it'll be quite interesting to see how quickly he can get his legs under the table. For Lando, I think he came on so much last year. There was a real maturity about him. And I'm wondering whether this year, he'll be able to hopefully carry that momentum that he had in Abu Dhabi straight into this year and hit the ground running.
Do we think Lando is overlooked, underrated? Because it interests me that he's a driver that's not often spoken about, because we know contracts in Formula One, you can, tear up a piece of paper pretty easily now that most contracts are done virtually. But when we talk about the future, when we talk about who might Mercedes want to sign, who might Ferrari want to sign, who might Red Bull be looking at, why is Lando not a driver that we talk about? Is it that he is so tied into the fabric of what makes McLaren? Or is it that he hasn't shown enough yet for us to really start to think about him on those same terms?
I think it's a mix of both. I think Lando's shown flashes last year of what he can really become in the future. But then you've got other drivers like a George Russell linked to Mercedes having that massive weekend in Bahrain, and they're just able to shout a little louder kind of with their antics on track. I think Lando won't be too bothered that we're not talking about him in that way now, because he's kind of going in underneath the radar, settling in, improving race on race, year on year. And I think Daniel's going to have a real tough teammate this year. And I think that hopefully will drive the team collectively forward, or at least that's what they're hoping it will do.
This is it, isn't it? We've seen Lando can play nicely with a teammate and pull the team forward. We saw Daniel do it with Max at Red Bull as well. The chances or the prospect of these two pushing the team forward but maintaining a cordial relationship is one of the most exciting things going into this season, as you've already said, that Mercedes engine in the back of the car. And as we look to the launch itself, the reveal of the car, what we all were watching that launch for, I guess some big questions to answer as to what exactly we learned today at that launch with the MCL35M. So, Lawrence, we've seen the car, we've seen the MCL35M. What are your initial thoughts?
That it's still orange and it's still blue. It looks very similar, to be fair, to last year, and we shouldn't be shocked on first glance. There will be little details across that car. James Key would have had his kind of pencil out, kind of sketching out elements that he'll want to change. Let's not forget also that this is just the launch spec car. I think the car that we see first at the shakedown tomorrow, then at pre-season testing, and then at the first race in Bahrain, I think they'll be very different in those iterations. But early doors, I'm excited, maybe because it's a new car. It's the first new car.
Two areas on that car have really interested me. Obviously, the rear of the car is always going to interest everybody. The architecture of that Mercedes engine is so different to the Renault. How you go about the cooling, how you put together the rear of the car. What's interested me most is if you look at the side pods, they're pretty much just the side impact structures, and then they just disappear to nothing. The tightness of the rear of the car, Lando commented on it in the launch video. They didn't show us many close-ups of the rear of that car. There's a very good reason for that. They don't want us seeing what's going on at the rear of that car, particularly around the rear wheels. They sort of joked that the car was on its way to Silverstone for the television for the filming day. Part of that as well is I don't think they want any angles of that car that they haven't gone over and checked 100 times, because they don't want it out. The Coke bottle, the rear packaging, incredibly tight, but also how McLaren, I think, have used the space between the front wheels and that side pod. They were really instrumental in using that space 2 years ago and developing that area. And that's somewhere, again, that I think they've paid a lot of attention to try and claw back some of that downforce they will have lost with these new regs.
I think that's one of the benefits of the regulation staying reasonably stable, is because that means the team can push everything forward as much as they can. They can tighten everything up, like you were talking about, the tighter side pods, the tighter rear end. It will be interesting to see now what steps the McLaren take in that further development, because obviously they've got to start thinking about next year and balancing that with the 2022 development, and then how quickly we see those upgrades come in this year.
Yeah, absolutely. It's going to be an amazing year to see who, as you say, develops how much for this year, who's focusing on what for 2022. But as you say, not a lot to learn from the initial images, because it will develop through until we get to Bahrain. It will develop through testing to the first race and beyond that. But I think a certain amount of excitement. Obviously, they've used their tokens wisely. They've had to. They've also been given some allowances, though, for that changeover of power unit provider.
Yes, so they were unique in that they were the only team on the grid switching over. So the FIA and also collectively all the teams, there's that understanding that they had to make tweaks for that. Obviously, there's little areas around the gearbox, for example, that's going to have to change. But you mentioned cooling, that's going to have to be all new because the engine will just react in a different way to the Renault engine. So while there's excitement because they've got the class leading engine, there's also risk because there's a lot of change on that car. They've had to make compromises by plugging in an engine into a car that wasn't supposed to be in that format, because they were supposed to have the brand new regulations, of course, for this year. So there are compromises there. So it will just be interesting to see how that technical team managed to balance that and try to make the best out of it.
It's the age-old question of risk versus reward, which brings us to the ultimate question of the team's strengths and weaknesses. Lawrence, as you brought up perfectly when talking about the launch car, they have this strength in that they are pretty much the only team with what could be considered a fairly new, or certainly very developed car from what we saw in 2020. But with that opportunity, there is also a massive inherent risk.
And the difficulty for them this year is there's only 3 days of pre-season testing. Then you're going to get the first race coming pretty quickly. We're in this world of COVID where just movement is difficult. Production is slightly slower. There's all these elements, and it's probably not the ideal year to be taking those kind of risks, but it could all play off brilliantly. They could have a really good relationship with Mercedes this year, and that sets them up really nicely for next year. They can learn a lot. So like you said, risk and rewards, they're definitely going to be one of the big stories this year. They'll be hoping it's for the right reasons, but it could very well be for the wrong ones.
And of course, Mercedes saying just this last week that their expectations on their engine, they're having to hold back a little bit because they've been experiencing problems over the winter.
And it's not very often that we say that about not just the Mercedes engine, but Mercedes as a whole, that they have problems. So it's very interesting, that they were comfortable enough to admit that publicly, but also that it's this close to a season that they're disclosing that kind of issue, or those kind of issues that they're encountering. So McLaren, of course, they've just got to keep their heads down and take what they get from Mercedes. And I think they'll generally be pretty comfortable with the decision that they've got, because that engine since 2014, since this hybrid turbo era, has been brilliant.
We're talking about strengths and weaknesses. One of the strengths McLaren have had in recent years is that momentum carried from year to year, the continual steps forward brought about by the strength in a solid and dependable leadership, which has remained unchanged. This is clearly a strength, but with the expectation on taking a forward step every year, having finished third in the constructors last year, is expectation too high that next step will take them to being consistent podium finishers, maybe even race winners?
It's McLaren in a really difficult position this year, because if they finish third again, that's kind of meeting expectations. But to do so is going to be really difficult, because you've got a revised Aston Martin operation rebranded. You've got a revised Renault operation rebranded Alpine. For them to be able to do that is going to be quite tricky. I think for them, their idea and the way that they talked at the launch is they just want to make steps forward. So they want to be closing that gap to Mercedes and Red Bull. And I guess the ultimate figure, the final figure, isn't really what's in their immediate mindset. Obviously, it's not going to look brilliant if they end up sixth in the Constructors' Championship, for example. They're going to want to finish as high up as they can. But I think for them, they just want to be making these steps, because hopefully with the 2022 regulations, they can make that big step to make them a race-winning contending team once again.
And 2 alpha drivers. Some teams say you can't have 2 alpha drivers. Is it a strength, or is that lineup a weakness?
Well, I'm certainly looking forward to seeing how it plays out. I think that if they manage it well, and both personalities manage the situation well, I think it can be a huge strength. I just don't see between them the kind of character traits that are going to irritate each other. I just personally, at least at this stage, I don't see that coming. But it only takes one result or one on-track incident or one decision going against them to change that dynamic. So again, it's another reason why McLaren is such a great team to watch this year, because watching that relationship evolve, and whether it will become a bromance or whether it will become a bitter feud like Lewis and Nico, it's going to be interesting to see how it plays out.
It certainly will. All of which, I guess, brings us to the topic of what would be a good year and what would be a disappointing season for McLaren. So, Lawrence, as you've said, the expectation now is third in the Constructors' Championship. Is it as simple as that, that anything less than third will be a failure?
I think that for fans or people from the outside, anything less than third will be a failure. But I think internally, I think there'll be an acceptance that achieving that for a second time around is going to be challenging. I think that as long as they show yet more step-by-step improvement, and they show that they're closing the gap to those in front and keeping those behind, or at least competing quite strongly against them, I think they've got to end this year quite happy.
It's a difficult one, isn't it? Because to take that next step, to take on a Red Bull with Honda throwing everything at their last year as Honda in the sport, with Mercedes going for another world championship, and to keep that perfect run going, how on earth do you take that step to be a consistent weekend by weekend podium and race win threat? It's just, it's the holy grail. How do you make that step as a team like McLaren? And here's the thing, and that's why we're talking about, holding on to third would be actually an achievement in and of itself. Moving to Mercedes power, when a team like Racing Point, now Aston Martin, has that strength of a relationship with Mercedes, the closeness of that bond, beating them is going to be tough as well. And we have Alpine coming on strong. Will Daniel regret his decision to leave a rejuvenated Alpine now that everything's being thrown at them as well? There's a lot that could trip McLaren up, not least Ferrari wanting to get back to their ways as well.
Of course, Ferrari and the massive resources that they bring to their operation. And while I don't think we're going to see massive steps from them, I think they're going to be a greater threat. I think what people have probably got to remember this year is that McLaren overperformed last year. So when you're trying to compare what they do this year to last year, you've got to take that into account. And it'll be difficult to be too hard on them if they do end up, say, fourth or fifth, because of that overperformance. Closing that gap, like you said, to Mercedes and Red Bull is so difficult. But I think that if you take a couple of tenths out this year, that's huge. That gap, is over a second at some circuits. And for them to be able to show that kind of ability to close that gap, and that their design direction is the right way, and they've got the team of people who are making that consistent improvement, I think that will motivate them for the future. And the important thing is McLaren are a team who know how to win. They've got a core group of people there who have competed at the front. Operationally, they're very strong as well. It's all these little things that when they get a car that can compete, I feel like McLaren are quite well placed to do that.
Is it the case that they can only disappoint them this year if finishing third is as good as they can do?
Yeah.
Is there that element?
I think you're right, Will, because the reality is they're not going to finish higher than Mercedes and Red Bull. And the likelihood is that an Aston Martin, like you said, who've had that relationship with Mercedes for so long, are going to be a real contender this year, especially with a bit more stability with their car from last year to this year. They struggled a little bit to understand it. I think that McLaren are really going to struggle. And yeah, it's difficult to look at what could be a good year for them. You're right. It's going to be difficult.
I think they're going to be one of the most interesting teams to watch on track this year. Bringing McLaren and Mercedes back together again has such excitement, seeing how Daniel fits into the team as well, looking at how they take that momentum from 19 and 20 and implement it for 21, all the while with that focus of 22, operating under the budget cap. And of course, the knowledge that, I guess, finishing a couple of places further down the championship adds so much to the wind tunnel time that you're going to get for the future seasons as well. There's there's an ebb and a flow, and there's positives and negatives in every finishing position for every season into the future. It's going to be an absolutely fascinating one. And I think McLaren will make headlines no matter what becomes of their season.
Yeah, and I think that's great for Formula One. It's great for a team like McLaren, who spent so many years obviously struggling with Honda. It's been so long since they won a race, 2012. I think for them to even just be on this trajectory, and for them to be in this conversation, and for us to even be talking about third being a disappointment, I think we've got to remember that just shows how far McLaren have come. There's a real buzz around that team, just the way that they even presented themselves at this launch today. You can just see that this is a team that feels like it's going places. So let's see if they can continue that momentum.
Can they win a race? And I know we've not even seen the car hit the track yet, so it's impossible to say, but can they win a race? Do you feel in your bones in 2021?
Yeah, of course they can, because, you know, Pierre Gasly won for AlphaTauri last year.
Okay, not a crazy Monza upside down red flag race. Like, on merit, can McLaren win a race? Do you think?
No, they can't. Oh, that's a slightly.
See, I'm going to say yes. I'm going to say, with the positivity, with the momentum, with everything, just looking at the aggressive design on that car, with how tight everything is, I just think it's a really beautifully put together car. I think it could be, I don't know, man. Look, it's the first car. You can't say anything yet.
Of course.
I want to believe, and I'd love to believe, that McLaren can get up there and do something special this year. God, it'd be great just to see that next step.
But if if we've got a McLaren, then we've got other midfield teams challenging for race wins on merit. What a season we've got in store. Yeah. And you know what? I do think McLaren we're going to be talking about them for the right reasons. They're going to be challenging for podiums for sure this year. And I think that puts them in a position that even in a good race, some people will have problems and they could win races. I like your optimism, Will. I think that bodes well for this year.
Well, mate, here we are, night one. The first car's just been launched, and we're all getting overexcited already about the prospect of new winners in the season. What will we be like after all 10 cars have been unveiled? Thanks for your insight, buddy. As always, we will look forward, folks, to welcoming you back for the next car launch. But for now, from Lawrence, for myself, as we look back on McLaren launching the first car of 2021, the MCL35M, thanks for tuning in, and we'll see you next time.